Divorce TV with Wally Marcus. The Culture of Divorce with attorneys Marie Picaretta and Mary G. Marcus. Support for Divorce TV is made possible in part by funding from the Center for Divorce Mediation, 577-1202. Welcome to Divorce TV. I'm your host, Wally Marcus, and our topic for today is the culture of divorce. Our guests are attorney Marie Picaretta and Dr. Mary G. Marcus. You can get more information about our program by checking out the website that we occasionally show at the bottom of our screen. We look forward to hearing from you. Our views of divorce, or what I like to call the culture of divorce, have dramatically changed since I started practicing law. We have gone from divorce not being allowed to divorce being allowed, but the parties being stigmatized, to divorce being acceptable. I'm not sure what the next stage will be. Our view of the culture of divorce is important for many reasons, but for me, our view of the culture of divorce is important because it also determines how couples get divorced. How couples get divorced influences how families function. Movies illustrate society's attitude towards divorce. It is hard to say whether this led to a change of divorce law, or both movies and the change of divorce law led to an increase in the divorce rate, or the issue, for instance, of the advantage of being the plaintiff. Old movies like My Next Husband with Lucille Ball was a typical comedy of the era that featured divorcing parties rushing off to Nevada for a divorce, with each trying to prevent the other from reaching Nevada first. The 1930s movies were an anti-divorce, stay-put message of movies' unhappiness in marriage. But what other influences did divorce have? What influences did divorce have on more recent movies' culture? What influence have more recent movies had on the culture of divorce? For example, the War of the Roses scene where the lawyer says, "There are no winners." What does this all say about the divorce process? Movies have lots of presumptions in them. Any movies that you've seen which you think have influenced divorce?
Well, I think, as you said, it may be the other way around, that what was happening in society changes the types of movies we see. So Kramer versus Kramer, which I think of as a really classic movie about parenting, came out, I think, in 1979, and it was the first time that a lot of people in America had seen a father having custody of a child, and it really was quite revolutionary to people. And I think that may have kicked off some of the fathers' rights movement that we see now. And so I think it both influenced the movie, and the movie has influenced all of us.
Another one, I think, a big movie that was, besides Kramer versus Kramer, was War of the Roses. Marie, you remember seeing that one a while ago?
Marie's too young to have seen that.
I remember War of the Roses.
And I'm always remembering the scene in the War of the Roses in which it shows really the craziness of how couples are in divorce cases, and in fact it shows her taking her car, which is a big SUV, driving over his Morgan and smashing it. I don't think you see a lot of that in the mediation cases that you handle, but how do you think that those kind of cases influence the way people perceive divorce?
I do think that just in the 15 years that my practice has focused exclusively on divorce mediation and mediation, I have seen some tremendous changes and perceptions. The culture has changed in terms of parenting, in terms of alimony, or in Arizona it's called spousal support, in terms of many preconceived notions. I'm not sure that's movies are the only reason for that.
I think some of the movies that we see sometimes is a barometer of what's happening in real life.
I really do think that things are different than they used to be, and of course there's still some very adversarial divorces and cases where people have destroyed each other's property, but it really is the exception, not the rule. Most people are trying to figure out a way to continue in a successful way in their life, even though they're not married anymore, and everybody.
I think we started trying to look at a little bit of what the culture of divorce is and what influences those changes. And as I said, I'm not sure which comes first, the cart or the horse here.
Well, I think there are huge changes that have occurred over the years. I mean, the early 70s being a gigantic time of change, I think, when no-fault divorce came into being. And so a lot of people who are alive now don't remember back to a time when people had to come up with reasons for divorcing their spouse in order to get divorced, or had to come up with reasons for getting more of the assets. And so you had that madcap Lucille Ball movie, which really was about the person who got to Nevada first, which was Reno at the time, which was the divorce capital, and that was going to give that person an advantage somehow, if they got there first and they could be the plaintiff. And we don't see those kinds of things anymore. And so I think divorce has changed tremendously.
You know, another thing that I think has contributed to the change is that most families now have two breadwinners.
Exactly.
And that has, I think, if you had to pick the one thing that would be, you know, if you had to pick something that, what has changed the culture of divorce, it's that you don't any longer have one person who's the breadwinner and another person who is not. And so you are talking to people in a very different way now about what their future is going to look like.
Well, it's going to be interesting going back to Kramer versus Kramer again, though, because in Kramer versus Kramer, he was working all the time, and so he wasn't home a lot. And then she was feeling somewhat abandoned, I believe, and he wasn't parenting the same way. And then once he became the full-time parent, he actually lost his job, and she was making more money than he was. So I'm not sure also how that influences the way people perceive. I mean, it seems to be in the cases that we see over the years, people see these movies and then they come in. It's a little bit like the doctors who, you know, people read about some disease over the weekend and then they call the doctor that week and say, that's what I have.
Well, I think movies do influence people's expectations, and so I think War of the Roses was a classic litigated divorce movie, and it told people how awful litigated divorces can be, and so perhaps got a lot of people thinking there must be a better alternative.
Well, that's contrary to the earlier movies, the 1930 movies, which in fact had, let's stay put, and divorce is bad. I mean, divorce seems to me has been bad, and so the movies sort of emphasize that you stay in a bad marriage no matter what, but it seems to me that more current movies are reflecting a societal attitude towards that divorce is at least acceptable.
I think that's true, and I think what Marie was saying plays a very important part in that. I think when women began to be the second breadwinner in families, women became able to consider divorce in unhappy marriages. And I think prior to that, it was very difficult for women to consider divorce because they didn't have economic independence. And I think that's made a huge difference and probably drove up the divorce rate, which is not something that anyone thinks is wonderful. But I think that people not only didn't feel as stigmatized, but they also had the economic resources to be able to live separately. I think we're going back in the opposite direction now with the housing crisis. So maybe we'll see fewer divorces again.
You know, I'm sure that there are people whose decisions about divorce are impacted by watching the movie. But I think more people are impacted by what other people who they know in their community are doing. In my practice, I hear all the time, well, so-and-so, my neighbor got divorced and they got thus and so. Or, and more commonly, even in parenting. Well, we have lots of friends who've divorced and their children are friends with our children, and you know, they're doing thus and so as a parenting plan, and that seems to work for them.
I had one of these like that, Marie, where I always loved, where the woman said she wanted, believe it or not, $300,000 a year in alimony, and I said, why did you want $300,000 in years of alimony? And she said, my neighbor did, here's her agreement. I want the same thing she got, with no relationship at all to any other facts.
But as a mediator, that's pretty easy to overcome. You can explain that away, usually. Those kind of, strange, extreme results, because in that situation, there's probably something very different.
We've been talking a little bit about sort of the financial influences of movies, and once again, I'm still not sure which comes first here, whether the movies reflect a society or a little bit of both. But what about the movies influencing the parenting issues? Once again, Kramer versus Kramer being one of the classic movies talking about that, where the father became the full-time parent, the mother left, which was unusual for that to happen. But how do you think that, once again, movies